Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Phases. Today, we are going to be talking about 5 parenting hacks for ADHD.
I'm really excited as somebody who has ADHD. A lot of the things that I do teaching our kids is like trying to use tools that I've learned in my life. But I love learning things from you. So I'm super excited to hear what these are.
Great. Well, I'm Dr. Courtney Talinsky. I'm a licensed clinical and school psychologist here in the state of Colorado. And with me is my incredible husband, Scott.
I'm a podcaster. That's what I do. I teach computer programming on the web and I do podcasting. So that's who I am. But I also am neurodivergent and I'm going to share some of my life learnings growing up and then the things that I've learned from Courtney as well. But we're going to be leaning on her expertise and we're going to be diving into all of the ADHD topics in this one. So before we get going on these 5 hacks here, for folks who are, maybe just finding out about ADHD and what it is actually, because I know there's a ton of misinformation online, can you give just a quick rundown of ADHD at its core? We'll obviously dive deeper into it in other episodes, but do you want to let the audience know a little bit about what it is and, what it entails?
Yeah, so I will try to keep this short, but
Yeah.
ADHD, it is often challenges with attention and executive functioning. And what's interesting is it's not so much that you can't focus, but that you can't regulate your focus and your executive functioning to the task at hand, right? So some kids can hyper focus or spend extra time on something, and really dive deep into things. But it's really hard to pull them away from that task. But at school or in a task that they're not interested in, like go clean your room, it's almost impossible, right? So
Yeah.
it is skills of regulating your attention and your executive functioning skills, which are if you think about like your frontal lobe of your brain, they're tasks of like organizing, time management, controlling your emotions, impulse control, behavior regulation, all of those key elements of control and forethought
Mm. And I have
are
no personal
are
experience
often
there, right? I did.
right,
uh,
yeah. So are often affected by ADHD. So there are a couple different types. So there's the inattentive type where, kids often struggle to focus or totally disorganized, they lose their things, etc. There's the hyperactive impulsive type, which most people tend to think about when you hear ADHD. So these are kids that are constantly like running around and are loud and have really big play, and do things or say things before they think about them, right? That's that impulsivity. And then there's the combined type where you may struggle with both.
mm.
So that's what we're going to be talking about today, are 5 different parenting hacks if you have a child or you suspect you have a child with ADHD.
Yeah, I love that. So let's get into hack number one, which you have as externalize everything. What does that mean?
Yeah, so with ADHD, often working memory is affected, right?
Mm.
And you know this firsthand.
Do I? Yes.
Yes, you do. So if I say something, or if you say something to a child with ADHD and it has multiple steps, like clean your room, put your shoes on, get your water bottle, get your snacks, and grab your coat, right? They may remember the last thing you said, but they've forgotten the other things that you've
Hmm.
said. Or they'll do the first thing and then as they're doing that, they get distracted, and then all of a sudden they're doing something completely different. So it's that piece of working memory and following multi step directions that's really difficult for them, and just staying focused. So when we talk about externalizing everything, we really want to rely on visual tools to help compensate for challenges with auditory working memory, right? So these are things like creating checklists, right? And ChatGPT or, any sort of AI is so good for this. So if you have, pretty much your morning and bedtime routines, if you have
Hmm.
young kids, is probably the same every day, right? You're doing the same things. But your kid with ADHD will often need like 5, 10 reminders to complete those things, or maybe they forget something, or they need check-ins because, like I said, they get distracted.
And man, I will say this, even though I know this to be true in my own brain and how things enter my brain and exit them, when your child is not like executing things because of how you're saying this works, it can get really frustrating, right?
Oh, it's so frustrating. Like, you've asked them, "Please put your shoes on," like 3 times,
Yes.
and then you step out the door, you come back, and then all
Where
of a
are your
sudden they're
shoes?
they're doing something else or the
Yeah.
shoes haven't moved. Oh, it's so frustrating. Yeah. So, and the kids know it's frustrating too, but they just can't help it.
Yeah.
There's often not bad intention or like bad, like behavior behind it. It's just a lack of skill, right? Which is a lack of being able to stay on task and to not get distracted.
Yeah.
Right. As a parent, you can feel like, well, I said it 5 times. Like, why can't you get it? But it's not often because they don't want to or they don't care. It's just because something else is more interesting or they're overwhelmed.
Yeah, it's so hard to keep that in mind all the
It
time.
well, and especially like when you're stressed, you're, trying to get out the door. Maybe you have other kids, that need your time and attention, or we have dogs and the
Yeah.
dogs get all worked up when you leave the house. That may just be our dog, but
Yeah, yeah, oh my god, our dogs are also a challenge, that's for
yes.
sure.
So having a visual schedule can be really helpful to give your child independence, which makes
Mm,
them feel good. Like, oh, I can do these things by myself. I don't need mom or dad to remind me to do this thing. Yeah. So it can be helpful for kids to have like a visual schedule or like a checklist essentially. So they know, okay, here's what I need to do in the morning and I can accomplish those things. Right. So you have like I was saying, AI or ChatGPT come up
mhm.
with like a little checklist that you can print off, or you can even use like a whiteboard or a piece of paper. It does not have to be fancy. Um, but if you want it to be, ChatGPT can do that. So, putting it out there as a checklist will help kids remember the steps that they need to accomplish something. And you can use this for anything, right? Whether it's cleaning your room, doing your homework, the morning and evening routines, doing their chores, whatever it is, have it written down because
Mm.
they often cannot rely on what you said because they've missed pieces of it.
It's
So
crazy
it
how
makes a
what
big
works for them
difference.
is also what works for me, but it's hard for me to always keep that in mind.
Yeah. Well, you do have ADHD.
Yes. Well, I mean,
So,
just like, I need things written down. I need things in lists. I need all of that.
yeah.
Yeah, totally.
And a lot of adults do. Like, I don't function well if I have a ton of things to do and I don't have a checklist. Often it creates like feedback loops in your brain, so it is helpful to write it down, get it out of your brain, and then you can tackle it one by one.
Yeah, totally.
So, using visuals is key for kids with ADHD.
Cool. Okay, so that is number one. The number two hack you have here is connect, then correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, this one I think is definitely important with the way that we see emotionally reactive behavior, especially from our son, where things turn into blow ups like really, really easily. So if your child is just losing it anytime there's minor criticisms, this could be helpful, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. And, it's not helpful to start giving corrective feedback in the middle of a meltdown, right? Like your brain is just not able to process what you should be doing or, adding fuel to the fire with like criticism, like, why'd you do that? Or,
Mm,
stop doing that. Like that's not helpful, and often kids with ADHD are highly sensitive to like criticism and critical feedback and just like sensory input in general. So it's really helpful to connect and then once they've calmed down or like sort of ridden the wave of getting frustrated and upset, then you help with the skill
mhm.
that's missing. Right. So let's think of an example. So our son, He really struggles. He's a great reader, but sometimes he struggles with spelling, and specifically if he knows that some of the words are going to be really difficult for him, then he just gets into like meltdown mode.
Mhm.
And he just starts, getting really red. Sometimes he holds his breath. He might hide under the table. He gets really worked up. And
Really
a
worked
lot of
up,
it
yeah.
is because he is such a perfectionist. Like, and often too, this is helpful to know, but with ADHD, a lot of other things tag along with that. So if your child has ADHD, they probably are also struggling with something else too, whether it is a learning disability, whether they develop anxiety, early or later
Mhm.
on in life, if they have autism, like all these things kind of like go together. And you're just more susceptible to having, we call them comorbidities in the field, but just having other things going on. So our son definitely has some anxiety as well with his ADHD, and it's really not helpful when he is dysregulated to start criticizing him or to say like, buddy, just do it, or
Yep.
you can do this. Sometimes even to like praise, it can be really difficult for him because is so upset he can't even process the praise.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah, that it is so tough, and one of the things that I've noticed is like just a really tough time of is once that starts ramping up, once they become so emotionally reactive, even like getting them down a little bit is tough because it's like as an adult, you have techniques and strategies of calming yourself down, but as a child, you're like deep breathe, and like that's gonna work.
Right, yeah, nobody wants to deep breathe, even though it's like the most helpful
Yeah,
tool
right.
we
Totally.
have,
I don't
like
want to deep
nobody
breathe, and
wants
I
to
know it
do
works. Yeah,
it.
yeah,
No, I know. So it's really helpful to connect first and empathize with your child. So whether that's, sitting there, and this is obviously age dependent, right? So we're talking about kind of like younger kids, so like maybe 0 to 8 to 10 maybe. Well, not 0. So we're talking about like, toddler through elementary school, right? It's
yeah,
so it's helpful to rub their back. You can say like, "Oh, I see you're having a really hard time. This feels really frustrating."
hmm
Right? You want to do your best on the spelling, but it's really hard for you. So identifying the things that you're seeing and kind of throwing it out there to see if that is what they're feeling, right? And sometimes it can be hypothetical, like, I wonder if you're really frustrated because you really care about doing well, but this is really hard for you,
mm-hmm.
and they could say, like, no, that's not it, and that's
Yeah, yeah,
fine,
yeah,
but you're throwing things out there. And what that does is it helps kids to link how they're feeling internally or physiologically to an actual feeling word,
yeah.
right? Because a lot of times, and even adults are terrible at this, a lot of adults, this is like a key foundation of emotion regulation is understanding like how I'm feeling in my body and putting that to a feeling like, oh, this is frustration, this is
Mm.
anger, this is anxiety, right? And Dr. Dan Siegel, who's one of like the prominent psychologists in the field, talks about, you have to name it to tame it, which I think is just brilliant. But that can really help calm behavior down, is when you say like, oh, I'm feeling X, right?
Yeah.
Because it helps externalize it, just as we were talking about. So, getting back to this one, so it's really important to connect first and help your child ride that wave of whatever it is that they're feeling: frustration, anxiety, sadness,
Mm.
and then providing the skills later once they're calm and regulated. And that may unfortunately even be the next day.
Yeah. Oh,
It may not be
yeah.
today,
Yeah.
especially if this is happening at night when a lot of like behavior things tend to happen, or before school. But you can always circle back to it and say, hey, but I remember yesterday you were having a really hard time with the spelling. We talked about how you were frustrated and you were really worried about not getting the words right. What do you think was going on? Or I wonder if we tried this next time, do you think that would help? So providing those skills later, I think can be really helpful.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, so let's move on to hack number 3, which is shrink the task. How do you shrink the task if the tasks are, well, big? I mean, you look at our son's room and you think that's a big task. How do you shrink that?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Well, yeah, so shrinking the task it's like a core executive functioning trait of it's called chunking in the field, or breaking down a big task like clean your room into smaller tasks that feel manageable, right? So not just like, "Hey, go clean your room, buddy." Like we can tell our daughter that and she'll just go do it.
Yeah.
She has really great executive functioning skills and she knows exactly what to do. She's on top of it. She does not need any supervision or support, right? She can just do it. But our son looks at the room and he's like, "Oh my gosh, this is so overwhelming. This is a really big deal." So what I do is I have a whiteboard for him and it has like a little slider of like, check, I did it, or
Mm,
X, it's not done. And then I just write down maybe like 5 things that I want him to do. And they're really direct and clear and simple. So it might say, pick up your Legos, right? So that's not just any toy. That's like a really specific toy that's like all over the floor,
yeah.
right? And then it might say, make your bed,
Yeah.
put books away. So they're really clear and it breaks down all of the different tasks that I can see in his room that need to be done into simple steps so he can just do one at a time rather than trying to tackle them all when they all have like different places that they go, or feeling really overwhelmed.
Yeah. Yeah. That is tough because it does feel like to me personally, like in the moment, you're asking them to do something. It doesn't always feel like, okay, let me come up with a 10-point strategy on breaking this, ask of them down into smaller chunks. So, is
Yeah.
there like a good tip you can have for just being in that mindset constantly? I think for me, that's like one of my biggest challenges is that, like, in the moment, you're not always carrying these tools around. And maybe this can be like a nice helpful for reminder for people, but like how do you make that effective in the moment?
Yeah. So, is it clear and specific?
Okay.
Right. So, not just clean your room, because I could say, like, well, what does that mean? Like, cleaning your room to one person might look different than cleaning it to somebody else. Right.
Yeah.
We all have sort of different standards. So, I think it's really important to like have clear expectations. And you could even ask your child, like, okay, if I say clean your room, what do you think that means? Right. So, you could
Mhm.
ask for their input and make sure you're on the same page. Or you could say, when I say clean your room, here's what I mean,
Yeah.
right?
Okay.
So just making sure, again, we're on the same page, and asking yourself, if I say this, is it clear enough? Are they going to understand what I think is
Mhm.
expected? Or do I need to like break this down further? Like I said, like pick up Legos, pick up stuffies, etc.
Yeah, I love that. Cool. All right, we ready to move on to the next one?
Yeah.
Cool. All right, the next one here is going to be allow for movement, which is when you say movement here, do you mean physical movement?
Yeah, I do. Yeah. So physical movement, and it doesn't just have to be like big body movement, like jumping around. It could just be like allow for wiggling or like fidgeting.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times kids with ADHD need that like physical movement to help promote attention and
Mhm.
regulation. And you can see that they're fidgeting with their hands, or they're like wiggling their torso, or they need to like walk around as they're processing something. So rather than expecting that your child like sit in a chair and be totally still and do their work, for example, like especially with homework,
Yeah.
um not all kids operate best that way.
Mm.
That's what we tend to think about with like a quote unquote good student or a good kid in a classroom. Like they're just sitting there and they're listening and their eyes are on the teacher and they're focused, right? They're not a problem. But kids with ADHD are distracted and they have a lot of things
Mm.
going on at once. So they need the movement to help stimulate their attention and their focus and emotion regulation, and they may not be looking at you, but that doesn't mean they're not listening.
Totally. Oh, that's something that I get a lot because I'm
Yeah.
often like doing my best listening when I'm not like looking at somebody,
Yeah,
when
because
I'm looking away, because it's like allowing my brain to focus purely on what they're saying rather than taking in like the visual stimuli, which is
right.
something I feel
Right.
like I don't know if people think I'm not listening or something, but that's definitely like for me personally, I'm doing my best listening when I'm not looking.
Yeah, and this is the same for kids with anxiety or autism as well.
Mm.
That eye contact piece, can be variable. So you have to, your kid, and you have to not just assume that they're not focused just because they're not looking at you. So, allowing for movement, I think that's so helpful. So I allow my son, like if we're doing spelling, because he struggles with writing,
Mm.
so we allow him to like orally dictate his spelling words, and I allow him to like move around the room that we're in, not around the house,
I was
but
gonna say
like,
how much movement, because sometimes he's, like,
yeah.
wanting to climb underneath the table, and, like, I think it's, like, actually doing more harm than good if he is doing some of that stuff.
Yeah, yeah. So I do check-ins like, "Buddy, are we focused?" And if I see it's kind of like
Mm,
escalating, like he's getting more dysregulated, then I limit it more. And you can even do things if you want to be more structured about it. Like they have bumpy cushions or like wiggle stools, which
ooh,
are great so
yes.
they can like sit. It's called a hokey
So
stool.
those actually work.
They do. Oh, for sure. And they have them in classrooms a lot for kids that really need them. But they do work, and it allows the kid to like they're seated in a position. They're not running around the room, but it allows them to move around.
Yeah,
Or they
okay.
have those like little standing trampolines you can jump on.
Oh.
So things like that I allow him to do. Other areas for movement could even be things like um, chewing gum or like having a mint or like I love like healthy crunchy snacks that allow for like oral
Mm.
sensory
Yeah,
input
you got a
while
lot of
focusing.
fruit and stuff around the house for that.
Yeah, but crunchy can be helpful because
Okay.
it requires more movement, like you have to
Mm.
chew it. So like
Wow.
carrots, for example,
Yeah.
can be great, or like healthy crackers or things like that. That can be helpful because it requires more movement while focusing. So it doesn't have to be like total body movement. You could also have a designated fidget. So not necessarily a fidget spinner, which that was like such a big thing, maybe like, I don't know, 5, 7 years ago. Like kids were getting fidget spinners and they're really like toys.
It's really funny to me because I, as somebody who does fidget quite a bit, that's like a thing I do. I never saw the appeal in a fidget spinner.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And it's not for everyone. But sometimes, if they have a fidget in the classroom, using that at home can be really helpful
Mm,
too. And I love this, like often doesn't happen, but I love like having a universal system like at home and school. So the expectations are
mm.
the same and they have the same tools, but sometimes it can be really hard to connect with what the teacher's
Yeah,
doing in the
that's the
classroom.
concern
Yeah.
there, right?
But
Yeah.
that's an ideal situation. So um other fidgets that you can have, it could be like a pencil or an eraser,
Mm,
could be like Play-Doh, or just something they can play with in their hands. But the big thing is that it's not distracting, right? You want it to enhance their focus, not distract them.
yeah, that's a tough balance. How do you make sure it doesn't become a distraction?
Well, you just have to monitor it and you have to be clear about, okay, here's your fidget, but these are the expectations.
Mm,
If I see you throw it, it's done. If I see you getting sidetracked, and it's not helping, then, it's not helpful. So we
yeah,
have to stop, just being really clear about how to use the fidget and incorporating it into the day to day.
yeah, I love that.
Yeah. So incorporating movement, allowing for that. And oftentimes your child will kind of like lead or show you what it is that they need. And if you're paying attention, you can encourage that movement or incorporate it, but, have some structure to it too, like we talked about.
Yeah, well, it does validate something for me. I have found that when I do use, I have a, treadmill under my desk, a little walking pad. That when I walk on the walking pad, I lock in to my tasks in a way that I don't when I'm sitting at my desk. And so that does validate as an adult too that movement piece. It is funny because as somebody who is well, I'm somebody who moves a lot in various ways, whether that's like
Yeah.
pacing or I used to drum on my legs a lot with my hands because I'm a drummer. There's like all kinds of little movement things that I've always done, but like I don't think I ever paid attention to that being a focusing thing for me.
Yeah. Yeah. I would see you do it in the car a lot, the drumming.
Mm,
Like if you weren't driving, obviously, if you were a passenger in the car.
yeah.
Yeah, I remember that. But yeah, so even adults, they do this, and people with ADHD tend to seek out movement or input. And sometimes things can be helpful that are like sensory grounding, like a weighted blanket.
Yeah, I love my weighted blanket.
Yeah, so it can be helpful too to like have an OT, like an occupational therapist, do a consultation and
Mhm.
see like what type of responder is your kid. Do they need like sensory input? Do they need like internal input, like we were talking about with the weighted blanket, or do they need movement? Are they like a seeker? So that's a whole different conversation. But I think just like paying attention to your child and seeing what they naturally seek out and providing opportunity for that in a structured way is great.
Sick. Yeah, awesome. Cool. All right. With the last ADHD parenting hack we have for you today is shift from punishment to skill building. This one's tough because, like, we grew up in an era where it does feel like, the ADHD behaviors can often feel like they're disruptive, intentionally disruptive, and
Yeah.
like the default mode goes into punish. So, how do you like
Yeah.
avoid doing that?
Yeah. Well, and now we're kind of in this phase, I guess, of what's called gentle parenting.
Yeah, you could say phase on this show. That is, I think we should have a sound
Well, I
effect
don't
every time somebody
I hate
does.
to call that a phase because I
Sure.
do believe in gentle parenting with like structure,
Yeah, with
right? So
guidelines or
not
yeah.
permissive parenting,
Mm.
but leading with empathy and validation of feelings. I think that that's important. So I hate to call that a phase, but I think culturally, like you were talking about, like we grew up in like punitive sort of
Sure.
culture with like timeouts and spanking and all that. And most parents are not doing that anymore. But it's tough because, like you said, a lot of times kids with ADHD or who are neurodivergent make choices that are impulsive or not appropriate, or they get overly dysregulated, and the expectations don't align with their choices,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
it can be extremely frustrating. But punishment is not helpful. If punishment worked, then we'd put our kids in timeout and then all of a sudden they would perform differently the next time. And
Mm.
often they don't, and if they're sitting in timeout, they're not often like thinking about what did I do wrong and what could I do better. Like it doesn't work. So it's really helpful to focus on skill building and talking about, like, I see you're doing that. That's not helpful, or that's not, what's expected.
Mm.
This is what we should do instead, and talking about that in an appropriate way. And it's really important for us as parents to understand, like, kids with ADHD, as we talked about, they're very sensitive. And there's a statistic out there, and hopefully I get this right, but it's for every like one criticism that you give a child with ADHD, they need like five positive
Yeah. That sticks with me.
reinforcements,
Yeah.
yeah, to
When you
kind
told
of
me that,
counteract that.
yeah, that really stuck with me when you told me that.
Yeah, and like I said, it's so easy, and the kids, they're just already getting so much more like negative feedback from the world because they are dysregulated and they're not always doing what they're supposed to be doing, so they get more negative feedback, and it's much harder on their self-esteem and on their mood, right? Than neurotypical kids who are not getting that. And like I said, they're just more sensitive to that. So it's really important to calmly tell them, like, hey, that's not okay. This is what we should do instead.
Mhm.
Right. Or this is what this looks like. Right. So, hey, we don't jump on the furniture in our house. We treat our furniture with respect. Here's what that looks like. Right. We're sitting on it. We, are taking care of it, whatever that is.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of a better example.
Well, no, I mean, these are the little things that just happen every day, and then it's easy to get frustrated. Like you're jumping on the couch again. We've already talked about this. I'm frustrated. you know?
Right,
Yeah.
right, right. Or, when you walk in the house, it's expected that you put your backpack away and your coat away and your shoes. And then you can go do what you want to do. But sometimes, like, our kids will just dump their stuff by the door and then they want to rush on their devices, which is so frustrating.
Oh yeah. Devices. Oh.
Yeah. So, I try to talk about like, this is expected, right? This is what we need to do before we can do this. So, first this, then that,
Mm-hmm.
and it is helpful when you can to frame it in a positive light. So, this looks like this instead of don't do this. So instead
Yeah.
of like, don't walk in the house with your shoes on, you can say, we take our shoes off before we enter the house.
Okay.
Or don't hit your sister. We say, calm hands and body, treat your sister with kindness, and of course, again, this is like developmentally appropriate. You have to adjust it to how old your child is. Our child is 8, so we're thinking about that from that perspective. Another thing too, which I think is helpful to understand, is kids with ADHD, they tend to be immature,
Mm-hmm.
either socially or emotionally, by about 2 to 3 years. Right. So you
Mm.
could have and this is where we get into tricky territory, because a lot of times kids with ADHD, I mean, there's no requirement on IQ. You can have ADHD at any IQ, but often we struggle with the kids who are like high average to like smarter, like gifted.
Yeah.
And so they have like this ability to talk to you almost like a advanced middle or high schooler if they're in elementary school. But then their behavior looks like a 4-year-old, and you're like, what
Mm.
is this disproportionality? Like, it's so frustrating because I have this expectation that, they're really smart and they know it's expected, but then they're acting so immaturely.
Yeah.
So it's really important to understand, like, you think about your kid's chronological age. So our child is 8, and sometimes he may act like a 5 to 6-year-old, like his emotional outbursts when we talked about the spelling, like that. And sometimes it's even more immature than that, not always, but you have to have flexibility for that they may show up not as their age, but more immaturely, because their
Mm.
frontal lobe, like we talked about, tends to develop more slowly.
Yeah.
So we say like that frontal lobe piece of like the executive functioning and decision making tends to be fully formed in adults, like neurotypical adults, by age 25. Right. But for kids with ADHD, it can look more like 27, 28. And
Mm.
sometimes there's still deficits, even as they progress into adulthood. So it's important to consider those things, to think about your child and their own personal strengths and challenges, and to help them build those skills of like, this is what's expected and this is what it looks like in a positive light when you can.
Yeah. Yeah, that's it. Again, these things are so tough in the moment. So, folks, if you're out there and you're like, this seems like really difficult for me to do all the time, to think about these things. It's a lot to
Yeah,
think
it's a
about.
lot.
I just know that, like, again, your whole goal from listening to this is to give yourself some tools so that when things are getting tough, you have ideas to fall back on, and strategies, rather than just using frustration or any of that. And again, it is all constantly a growing period for all of us who are getting into this. Unless you're like a fifth time parent or something and you've done it all and seen it all of us are really kind of experiencing all of these things for the first time. So,
Yeah, and with each, new age or stage brings new challenges.
what would you say with each new phase?
I would. Yes,
Okay,
I should
yes,
have
yeah.
said that. Yes. With each new phase comes new challenges,
Yeah.
So you have to like be flexible as a parent, and you can lean back on the things that you've learned, but understand like there needs to be some flexibility for this new developmental stage or struggle phase that they're struggling with, and go from there. But I think, like you said, it can be overwhelming, and it would probably be helpful to think about your own parenting strengths, right? And then maybe areas where you're not as strong, and maybe pick one of these hacks that you could work on. So thinking
Yeah.
about, okay, well, this week I'm going to focus on the skill building piece. Or this week I'm going to focus on like creating visuals for my kid and helping them with that. Rather than being overwhelmed by all the things, like break it down for yourself. Use these
Yeah.
strategies for yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. So to recap briefly, you want to externalize. And externalize again was to write things down, right? Make things
Mhm.
uh, easy for them to consume so they're not just relying on their memory. You want to connect first and criticize, criticize, connect first and then correct second. You'll want to shrink the ask into smaller things. You'll want to allow for movement, and you'll want to work on building skills and not shame by shifting from punishment to skill building.
Yeah.
Did you have anything else for us, Court?
No, I think that's a great place to start. And I know we'll spend a lot more time talking about this, but it's also helpful to know that these strategies can work for any kid, not just a kid with ADHD. They're especially helpful for kids with ADHD, but I think they work for all kids. So I think all parents can learn something from this.
Yeah, I love that. Well, thank you so much for sharing your expertise here. I'm going to keep a lot of these in mind, and I've heard most of these from you in the past, but I do think that it's something that is so handy to have a reminder on. So, again, this is an episode you can revisit several times. These are things that you can give yourself a refresher on and make sure that when you're ready to implement one of these new strategies, you can go back and listen to that section once again. So, thank you so much for sharing your expertise, Court.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us.
Bye.